This is the Knifechete from my Gavko on YouTube. It's a very interesting blade. I've been using it for the past couple of days. This is the one that he commented that there was a slight warp in the blade. As an interesting just side note, there's been some comments on the forum that I sort of run about how open or forthright makers or manufacturers should be expected to be about the performance of their products, and the right or wrongness of using certain statements or censoring other statements so as to create an image of their product in the mind of the consumer. I have relatively strong opinions on that, and do not believe in censoring valid information about your product, or in general censoring information, or making misleading statements or leveraging ignorance, that kind of thing. The thing that I respect about people like Mike is they take it to a whole different level. There is only a very slight warp in this blade, and you'll never see it unless someone was to point it out to you and you were to sight right down the blade. Mike spotted it after he had done a fair amount of work on it, and then decided not to sell it, even though he suspected it wouldn't be a performance issue, because he simply just didn't want to sell a blade with a slight flaw. So again, I respect people who go above and beyond what you could normally argue for is what they should do, and are providing a whole different level of service and respect, from my point of view, to the client. In any case, the interesting thing about this as a sort of chopping or bush type knife is that it's very different from some of the other blades that I've used and own, such as Dan Keffler's custom knife. And the main functional reason comes down to the fact that this is much more narrow and much more tapered, and what this produces is a knife which is focused more upon speed and snap chopping, because you're cutting mainly out here, versus shorter and stubbier blades where you'll be cutting closer to the handle. And that's an interesting knife to work with, and for some people a faster chop might actually be much more productive than a slower sort of inertial based chop. It just mainly depends on how you actually work and your type of experience and how you like to use large knives. The other thing that I found was that this is very nice because of the very nimble point, and because of the fact that the center of mass is actually relatively close to the handle. It's about right here, so that when you shift forward on a grip like this, it's not neutral by any means, but it does only produce a relatively slight torque in hand, and you can even compensate by that by going above the top of it, as I often do, and the handle is very nicely rounded up here. So you end up with a much more nimble blade up around the tip, which allows you to get in and out and clear very dense growth relatively well. So it was very nice from that perspective. I also found that along with this, as I said, sort of big sweet spot up here, which is good for faster chopping, the handle is actually long enough that you can shift fully back on the grip like this. Now, interestingly enough, when you do that, when you shift back on the handle, you shift the power point, or your sweet spot on the blade comes back as well. So when you're working up here, you want to be chopping up here. When you shift back here, you'll end up wanting to be chopping down here. So it's kind of interesting that what I found I was often doing was, when I was clearing brush, I was working right up here by the tip, and it works very well for that. And then when I wanted to chop off a section by the trunk, or just break up a piece of wood into heavier sections, I'd shift back here and I'd do the slower, more impact-based chops down and around this area. Now, this is made out of S7, hardened by Peters. When I got it, the thickness of the blade behind the edge bevel was around 7 to 9 thousandths. Think about that for a minute, because if that doesn't strike you as an extremely lean grind, well, you got pretty exceptional standards. I worked with quite a bit of wood, no real issues. Then I moved to some difficult wood to cut. And while this mightn't look overly impressive, it's gone completely blasty, which means it's been dried out, got wet, dried out a number of times. It's split. It's very hard, and it has large rings, sections of pin knots all the way through it. This is difficult to cut on a blade because what happens if you cut around this area where the knots are, the blade naturally will try to move in the wood because you're not a machine, you don't cut on an exact angle. And if you were to watch the blade in super slow motion, you'd see it was actually wobbling as it's going through the wood. Well, the problem is if part of the blade is in the knot, it's held very tightly, and the other part of the blade is free to move around. So that's why you can often get slight ripples if you hit a knot, because the knot will hold that piece of blade very tightly. And I did manage to turn the edge in a couple of sections up by the tip, rather minor, when I was working on those sections, using a heavy amount of power. But for an edge which was under 10 thousandths thick, seems impressive to me. No damage in terms of fracture, just slight deformation. I then went a bit more demanding, switched over to my left hand where I had the same amount of power but not the same amount of control, and did work all up along the blade and was able to turn it in a couple of sections down here by the base. That's sort of worst case scenario for me. I'm working with my offhand, have low control, lots of power, working on difficult wood. So I made a slight change to the blade geometry, and this is often where people do something which makes it worse even though they think they're making it better. What they often do is they increase the angle at the edge. Now that seems maybe like it would help, so you have an angle which is like this, the angle turns or warps, the blade does, and to try to decrease that you make the angle actually heavier. That will in fact make it more likely to actually turn. The reason why is when the blade goes into the wood, the force that the blade sees is directly related to how hard it is for the blade to push through the wood. And when you increase this very edge angle, you're making it harder for the edge to go into the wood, which means as soon as the blade hits the wood, as soon as it hits it, that force spikes up very high, because again you put a very high edge angle on it. I don't want that. I want that force to be as low as possible. So what I did was I reduced the edge angle. So the edge angle now is floating somewhere around 10 degrees per side. And what this does is it thickens up behind the edge, of course, because I've lowered the edge angle. Because what I want to do is I want to move the failure point out towards the apex, out towards where the very edge is. I want the angle set so low that when I overstress the blade, the very apex is what gets damaged. I don't want the angle that high that the angle, the edge, can never get damaged, because then the failure point will be higher up on the blade. Now you have to set this based on your own skill level, the amount of force that you're putting into the wood, the type of wood you're cutting, how you're chopping, and a number of other things. But I'm just giving you some general guidelines. If you do have that kind of issue, and you do get a little bit of damage or rippling to the very edge, you want to actually bring the edge angle down. The only time you bring the edge angle up is if the apex itself gets damaged. If the apex gets damaged, then you increase the edge angle. But if you get a rippling or an actual deforming or bending of the edge bevel itself, then you lower the edge angle to compensate for that. So with this slightly lower edge angle, as I said, it's going down to around 10 degrees per side, and I do put a final micro bevel on it. No issues, and I've been using it to cut up a fair amount of wood with no real problems. Now the other thing that people say is that the edge retention is too low in these class of steels. Unfortunately, a lot of people make these types of comments based on nothing, based on the fact of possibly a catcher test comparing S7 to some other steel. Who knows? The raw reality is wood is not tremendously abrasive at all, and you can cut a ginormous amount of wood before abrading an edge. And if you want to see the actual level of abrasion, put a scratch in an S7 blade or a 1050 or some other similar steel. Just take a piece of carbide and put a scratch in it. Now take a piece of wood and try to polish that scratch out and see how long it takes. Almost no abrasion. So wood chopping blades don't get blunted by abrasion at all. So putting carbides in them doesn't help you because abrasion is not what's causing them to go blunt. They go blunt because the edge dents, ripples, warps, and fractures. So the best edge retention you'll get out of a chopping blade is one that's very strong and very tough. The S7 class steels, and S5 is even slightly better, are very hard and immensely tough. Even at around 60 Rockwell or slightly above it, they'll still tend to deform before they actually break. They're very tough, and this is at a very high hardness. This has done a significant amount of chopping and is still very, very sharp for any kind of brushwork. And in fact, that's not a piece of 2x4. It's not a piece of wood. That's after literally hundreds of pieces of wood chopped up, which are all natural woods. It's nowhere near being necessary to sharpen. However, I actually do sharpen knives like this after every significant session of use, and the reason why I do is that it maximizes the edge retention. If you let the knife go to the point where it actually becomes significantly dull, the edge will have been dented and fractured on a microscopic level, relatively deep, because it piles up. So this knife is still cleanly slicing paper, so it doesn't need very much in terms of sharpening. So I'll probably take something like Sharpening 5000 or similar and just slightly repolish the edge bevel. If I see any points along the edge where it is reflecting light, I'll slightly de-stress the entire edge and then reset it. But if the edge isn't reflecting light, I'll just give it a little bit of a polish and then reset the apex bevel. And that keeps it able to do work for a significant period of time. In fact, for most large chopping blades like this, the only time I tend to actually need to sharpen them because they've gone dull is when they've hit dirty wood. So some of the wood is just on the ground, it's full of dirt. You're obviously not going to wash it before you cut it up. If you cut rocks and gravel, the edge will actually get abraded then and get dented, and then I have to break out a coarser stone. And that's one of the reasons why I tend to prefer very low carbide steels for knives like this. Because if you're cutting dirty wood, if the knife comes in contact with the ground when you're cutting low brush, it's going to get damaged. It doesn't matter what the steel is, it's going to get damaged at that point. And high carbide steels will take more damage and they'll be harder to restore. A final point about a couple of modifications I've made to the handle. I've increased the texture of this handle by sanding it with 80 grit sandpaper. That's just to give it more of the texture that I like. Some people like very smooth grips. I prefer a little bit of traction and a little bit of feedback. The other thing that I've done is I've smoothed out this very pronounced peak. And that's because the handle is a bit too narrow for me back here, and I don't get a very full grip on it. So with the very pronounced peak, I was sliding up on it and it was becoming a bit of a contact point. Not initially, but after I cut, say, about 100 pieces of wood, I'd probably feel a bit from that area. So what I did was I just rounded it out, and it's much more of a gentle transition there now, and that combined with the more tactile finish on the handle makes it more functional for me. So overall, very nice blade, very comfortable with using it after a couple of days, looks very promising, and I think it's going to be very useful in the summer and fall with harvesting a lot of the deadfall.